Hi, welcome to Module 5, the American Revolution. That's right, we're already at the revolution, the start of the revolution anyway. Today we're going to explore that beginning of the American Revolution, and we're going to see how liberty is changing. How is the meaning of liberty and freedom changing in the colonies from about 1763 right up to 1776. We're also going to focus on Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and you do have a tiny test primary source analysis of that, an excerpt from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. You also have some primary source analysis you're going to do as a group conversation, so you can see what other people got out of the primary source. That primary source is Paul Revere's depiction of the Boston Massacre. And then, of course, you just have a short Module 5 lecture exam. If you haven't done this, you might want to go ahead and make sure you've seen the questions on that Module 5 lecture exit exam, so you'll be ready to jot down the answers when we get to them. What are we focusing on today is, in many ways, the story of escalation. We're going to see colonial dissatisfaction escalating, and British politicians, British officials, I should say, and the Crown escalating right back. So every opportunity that Britain has to de-escalate the situation, we're going to see that they escalate it instead. We're going to talk about revolutionary public demonstrations and riots and what their role in the revolution, the early revolution especially, was. And then, like I said, we're going to look at the Boston Massacre and Thomas Paine's Common Sense, where I'm going to ask you a big question of where do you see that shift from English liberty, or English liberties, I should say, to natural liberty. Now we're going to start a little early. We're gonna go back to the 7 Years' War, or as the colonists call it, the French Indian War. It has various dates. We're interested in about 1756 to the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Yes, I'm aware that that's not 7 years. The 7 Years' War is a global war. So from a European perspective, this is going to be the 7 Years' War, and it's a global war between empires that have been fighting each other in the Americas: Spain, France, and England. This is the imperial map circa 1750. The French Indian War is going to absolutely demolish these French claims and remake this map. And if you look at this map from 1750, you're going to get a very false impression that England is the weakest of the European empires. It's actually the strongest. This is not filled with French people. This is not filled with Spaniards. The English have the strongest hold, in part because of their different policy of colonization. What we're seeing over here is English colonists that have pushed Native Americans west. Here we're seeing French trading posts, especially along the Mississippi River, and and around the Great Lakes. These trading posts are all about the French fur trade. Here, of course, you see that we have missions trying to stake control and keep control, especially when we go further north into real Apache territory. Now, like I said, this is a global war. This war is fought in the Americas. It's fought in the West Indies. It's fought in England, of course. It's fought in Asia. It's fought in the Philippines. This is a global war because these three empires have been colonizing the globe. What our British colonists are going to care about is the part of the 7 Years' War that takes place here. And let me get my laser pointer so I can show you what I'm pointing at. That takes place here in what we call the Mississippi River Valley. This area has been contested between France, between England, and between the Native Americans that are allying themselves with either the French or with the English. So we have these Native Americans playing European powers off of each other to try and secure their own power. And here is where I want to go back to here we go. In that Mississippi River Valley on the western frontier, which is Pittsburgh, if we're looking at Pennsylvania, in that western frontier, In 1754, George Washington attempted to dislodge French from Fort Duquesne, around present-day Pittsburgh, and from the English perspective, started this war. So the British are going to be like, George Washington, why did you start this global war for us to fight? George Washington is going to say, I was just trying to push the French off that Western territory that colonists want. All right. We had a lot to get through today, so I'm not going to tell you too much about the 7 Years' War. I will tell you that by 1760, British forces had captured the major outposts of New France. By 1760, they had seized French possessions in the Caribbean, and they had established control of India. Remember, this is a global war. In the Peace of Paris of 1763, France ceded all of that land. A lot of it's what now is Canada. Ceded that lands to Britain. In return, got the sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. Spain ceded Florida to Britain in return for the Philippines and Cuba, which the British had seized during the war. We see major reshufflings on this global map of colonization. Some of the biggest losers of this, the biggest winner is England, absolutely. The biggest loser isn't even France, it's the Native Americans that fought for France. We're going to see absolute destabilization within a decade of these Native American lands, especially in that Ohio River Valley and around the Great Lakes region. And we're going to see that this destabilizes the colonial relationship with the metropole, with England and with the crown. As England turns away from European problems, turns back to the colonies and says, okay, how are we going to pay for this war now? Colonies, that's what you exist for. You exist to enrich the metropole. You exist to enrich England. Let's get you paying for this war that, after all, you started, George Washington. That's the English perspective. Like I said, that one of the major, if we're going to say who lost this war, Native Americans lost this war. In 1764, a British observer said, quote, Indians, having never been conquered either by the English or the French, nor subject to their laws, consider themselves a free people. Pontiac, a French allied Native American leader, when the French were defeated and they ceded these lands to England, the problem is they didn't control these lands. They weren't really France's to control or to cede away. Pontiac says to the British, quote, you have defeated the French. You have not defeated us. So this French defeat upsets the balance of power, diplomacy that had enabled Native American groups like the Iroquois to maintain a degree of autonomy, The French, of course, conceded lands that Indians controlled to the British without their consent. The Treaty of Paris created massive confusion about land claims, control of the fur trade, tribal relations in general. As I said, this is a period of real destabilization. And in 1763, Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley and Great Lakes region rebelled against this new British rule. It's named Pontiac's Rebellion after this Ottawa warrior Pontiac, but in fact, Neolin, a Delaware religious prophet, inspired much of the rebellion with visions that urged Native Americans to reject European technologies, European dress, European trade relations. Neolin encouraged Native Americans to reject alcohol and to expel the British from their lands. He also encouraged Native Americans of different tribes who had been fighting each other in these European alliances. He encouraged them to set that aside and instead to consider themselves all Native Americans, creating a new in-group of Native Americans with the out-group being all Europeans. So instead of friend and foe, are you aligned with the French? Are you aligned with the British? Are you fighting against the Ottawa if you're in the Iroquois? Neolin says you have to stop that. We have more in common with each other than we do with Europeans. This is the idea of pan-Indianism, that Native Americans have more in common with each other across tribes, even though tribal distinctions, of course, matter. Yeah, all right. So Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac kept fighting. He did not surrender until 1766, but it's essentially over by the autumn of 1764. England's goal here is to prevent another Pontiac's rebellion, to try and stabilize this region, stabilize the fur trade so they can get some of that wealth and pay for the war. And in part, or as part of that attempt, in 1763, in the midst of Pontiac's rebellion, the crown declares this proclamation line. This line says, English colonists, you cannot cross. And you can see it goes right down here, down the Appalachians. England says, England says, colonists, you cannot cross this line. This is going to be how we're going to keep the peace with these various French allied Native Americans, keep the peace and stay put here on the Eastern seaboard. The problem is, colonists believed that they had been fighting in this region during the French Indian War. They believed that they had been fighting for this land. That was not the crown's goal, but that was Washington's men and British colonists' goal. We're going to fight this so that we can take this land. In fact, by 1763, colonial elites like George Washington are already land speculating. They're already selling land to the west, selling and buying land to the west of the proclamation line that they don't yet have any control of. There are still Native American tribes controlling that land. So this is going to anger the colonists. From the colonial perspective, they're going to say, hey, wait a second, we just won you a global war, expanded the English empire. Why can't we have this land here? From the English, from the metropole, from the crown's perspective, they're going to say, you just started a global war that we had to fight to bail you out of. Now stop causing trouble, stay put. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, we already have tensions between colonists and England, colonists and the crown. We're going to see those tensions escalate as Britain is going to try and pay off this war by raising money off of the colonies. That's what colonies exist for, according to the ideas of mercantilism. Colonies exist to enrich the crown, to enrich the country that you came from. And keep in mind, in 1763, colonists still consider themselves English. So the crown is going to say, why are you upset? When we enrich England, we enrich all of you. Aren't you English? Colonists still consider themselves English, and we're going to see that colonists are going to resist what they see as their rights as Englishmen being infringed on. They're going to rebel not at first to say we're not English. They're going to say, hey, we are English and you're not treating us like we're English with our English liberties. It's going to take a few years before colonial patriots start to consider themselves Americans. In those years, we're going to look at 1763 and 1776 are going to be filled with a series of escalations of British reactions as England and the crown turn their attention to the colonies and reassert their control that had waned under salutary neglect. So what are they going to do? They're going to tax the colonies. They're going to be like, all right, let's pay. The war chest is empty. We're broke. Colonists, we need to raise some money. I'm going to describe a series of Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Tea Act. And what I want you to pay attention to is the way that these are escalating. It starts in 64 with the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act actually lowered the tax on sugar, but because colonists had just been smuggling on the black market during salutary neglect, when England wasn't paying attention, they'd just been smuggling their sugar in. So they were already paying much lower prices. So the fact that the tax dropped, they didn't really care about because the Sugar Act also increased anti-smuggling efforts. So the tax was actually lowered, but England says, we're going to crack down on smuggling. That's what the colonists are unhappy about. They're like, no, smuggling is one of our favorite things. Seriously, the colonists love smuggling. This also put more goods under the Navigation Acts, which meant that, again, you had to trade only with England. You couldn't trade directly with France or Spain. The Navigation Acts meant, for instance, Pennsylvania and South Carolina couldn't trade with each other. So if Pennsylvania wants to buy rice from South Carolina sends it to England to be sold by an English merchant back to Pennsylvania. Putting more goods under the Navigation Act then is going to make trade slower and much more expensive. The next year, 1765, we see the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is actually the first attempt to tax the colonies directly rather than getting a lot of that money through trade. They're going to simply charge a tax for stamps, all stamped, all printed material, broadsides, newspapers, books, pamphlets, court documents. Colonists also love suing each other. Court documents all had to carry a stamp purchased by British authorities. Now, this is a tax that really only affects colonial elites who are going to demand that they not be taxed without parliamentary representation. Parliament is going to respond, wait, you're English. We are representing you. English Parliament represents all English people wherever they are around the globe. Colonial elites are going to say that's not good enough for us. And this prompts an attempt to boycott British imports. If Britain is trying to raise money off of trade with the colonies will say, well, maybe we will just stop buying stuff. And here we see one of my favorite pieces of material history, primary source, this little No Stamp Act pot. So when you invite your friends over for tea, they're going to see your politics right away as you pour from the No Stamp Act pot. This attempt to show patriotism was a little rocky to start with. The No Stamp Act teapot was actually made by crafters in England and sold to the colonies. They're like, what, you don't like England now? Fine, we'll sell you a teapot about it. But the colonists are going to get a lot better at boycotting and buying American as the revolution continues. Like I said, the Parliament says you are represented. Stop asking for nonsense. Less than 5% of men in England can vote. So Parliament's going to be like, what are you talking about? Almost no one votes for their representatives. So you're no different. You're not special, colonists. But the colonists have gotten used to voting for their own colonial assemblies. Now they want a say in Parliament as well. 1765, one of those colonial assemblies, the Virginia House of Burgesses, and the Stamp Act Congress, which is an intercolonial Congress. So a variety of colonies got together and said, we are going to resist this Stamp Act. And James Otis, of course, noted firebrand, says no taxation without representation, which becomes the rallying cry of the Stamp Act Congress. So far, we've just been talking about colonial elites. Colonial elites being upset they don't have a vote in Parliament, colonial elites working in colonial assemblies to respond to this, but they're going to need the cooperation and the energy and the effort of what we would call working class people to make this stick. Let's turn to what the role is of working class people in revolutionary sentiments, creating, enforcing patriotism. Sometimes we're going to see that working class people participated in the revolution in a variety of ways, not just through military service, of course, when the Revolutionary War begins, but through public riots, public protests, mock funerals for liberty. The working class people are going to be instrumental in enforcing boycotts. So buying American becomes something that working class people are going to not just do, but enforce in others. And we see that starting right with the Stamp Act. Widespread resistance took place, including these committees of correspondence. That sounds very fancy. Committees of correspondence are working class people who enforce patriotism of their neighbors. Basically, they keep an eye out. They say who's being patriotic. They're going to keep an eye out for what stores, what newspapers are actually putting stamp on their newspaper, and they're going to say we're going to boycott that. They also have these public mock funerals for liberty. So you literally get a casket, write liberty on the side, and walk through the streets saying, if the Stamp Act stands, liberty is dead. They would hang and burn British authorities in effigy. These are not real little people being hanged. These are, figures stuffed with straw to represent British authorities. And if we're talking British authorities, we're talking tax collectors, governors, lieutenant governors, and the British Army that is stationed in the colonies. All right. And where do you go when it's time? They're like, all right, it's time to resist the Stamp Act. They, in Boston, rallied around what became known as the Liberty Tree. In New York, they just erected a big pole and called it the Liberty Pole. Something going on today? Go down to the Liberty Pole, see what's happening. Here we see some of our crowd in Boston. We have the mock funeral over here. This is probably the governor in effigy that they're marching down the street and throwing probably horse poop at. It's probably what they're picking up off of the ground there. Now, colonial elites are encouraging this. Colonial elites are like, yes, get on our side. Let's do this. Let's resist. But colonial elites are going to have a problem because their desires aren't perfectly aligned with working class people. And the working class revolutionary protests can very quickly turn into revolutionary riots that colonial elites are going to really struggle and really fail at keeping under control. Probably the most important of those riots that erupt is the Stamp Act riot. Working class Bostonians attack the lieutenant governor's house after all of this rhetoric that the governor and the lieutenant governor are in league with Satan. Look, the devil has come for him with his list of crimes. This is the governor of Massachusetts here. So after all of this intense rhetoric ramps up, going the wrong direction. This riot where we see Bostonians attacking the lieutenant governor's house, they loot and burn it. The goal, they want to seize the lieutenant governor. He may have been harmed if they had succeeded, but he saw them coming and went out the back door with his family. Colonial elites are going to say, too far, you've gone too far. But for our working class patriots, they're going to say, no way, you told us. And we agreed that the source of our problems in the colonies is these governors, is the crown. We agree with you on that, so let's do something about it. England, or the British authorities, crack down, of course, after the Stamp Act riot, and a group calling themselves the Loyal Nine. These are colonial elites, wealthier merchants, artisans who own their own shop. This Loyal Nine promises British authorities, we will get control of our rowdy patriots, and we'll put an end to violent protest. It's a promise, that they can't quite keep. The British authorities react, and one quote that I think is really instructive for us, they say, there must be an abridgment of what are called English liberties. Basically, we have to put a stop to what these people consider their English liberties. All right, there's our poor governor again. I want to continue on that theme of cooperation between colonial elites and working class. So elite patriots, working class patriots. The Sons of Liberty in New York City are a really good example of how colonial elites relied on these working class folks to create anti-British sentiment and to enforce patriotism, especially to enforce non-use of these stamps and later non-importation, to stop buying British goods. And this enforcement and creation of anti-British sentiment, again, is sometimes under the threat of violence. If we look here, this is a poster put up by the Sons of Liberty. These are examples of the stamps that are under the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty did not dutifully go and get it stamped. These are just examples of this is what we're looking for. Pro patria, the first man that either distributes or makes use of stamped paper, let him take care of his house, person, and effects. Signed, Vox Populi. We see our elites and our working class men here. We see our elites in this use of Latin, pro patria, for country, Vox Populi, voice of the people. Most working class men, almost all working class men, do not know Latin in this time period. So we see that blend there. And here we have a threat of violence. The first man that distributes or makes use of stamped paper watch out. Keep an eye on yourself, your house, your stuff. We will come for you. This was the enforcement of patriotism that we see here in the Sons of Liberty. All right, we're getting right through this. That's a little bit out of order, because I want to talk about the Daughters of Liberty first. Sons of Liberty is an actual group in New York City. Daughters of Liberty are a way that historians refer to women's roles in these patriotic movements. One of the most important roles that women are going to have in the revolution is that non-importation movement. They're going to boycott buying British goods. And you're going to see that reflected not just in what they buy for their homes, but in fashion. Revolutionary fashion is going to change for men and women. Patriotic fashion is more simple. It's made with homespun fabrics, simple dresses. I know this might not look like a simple outfit to you, but she doesn't look like Marie Antoinette. And she doesn't have a huge wig on. So natural hair becomes something that is in vogue for patriots. And of course, you can see she's got her powder horn, her gun, and her tri-corner hat. So we really know that she's a patriot. Yeah, I want to scoot up here. I want to get over to the Boston Massacre. Time's a wasting. All right, let's talk about the Boston Massacre. You are going to discuss in your group Paul Revere's image of the Boston Massacre. But let's talk about what happened first, and then we're going to watch a very weird little video about it. Remember how I said smuggling was really popular? Yeah, and this wasn't just, this was something that colonial elites took part in. John Hancock, you know him, big signature. In 1768, there were riots in Boston after British authorities seized his smuggling ship, which was appropriately named Liberty. After this event, British soldiers are stationed in Boston, and they're at odds with colonial laborers, in part because being a British soldier does not pay very well. So they actually competed with working men in Boston over jobs. So there's some resentment that they're competing over jobs. On March 5th of 1770, a disorganized scuffle broke out between soldiers and Bostonians who were throwing snowballs. And, you know, there might have been like, you can put rocks in snowballs, but that's how it started. It started with this chaotic snowball fight between men who had already resented each other and were already at odds. This escalated into an armed conflict. We don't know exactly how it started, if it was one nervous soldier who fired early, if there was a mistake. We have no evidence that this was terribly well organized or that officers were in charge in this situation. John Adams defended these soldiers in court and said exactly that this wasn't a murder, that this was armed conflict, that the soldiers hadn't done anything wrong. Paul Revere, though, and the Sons of Liberty are going to depict this event as a massacre, and it is their depiction. It's this Paul Revere description that's going to take hold in colonial imagination. This is going to become the reality for colonial patriots, that this is what happened. The first person killed is understood to be Crispus Attucks. He's the first martyr of the revolution. And we are going to watch an extreme, like just a couple minutes of a very weird video. I like to find you weird things on YouTube. And this is one of my favorites. I don't know who these people are, who gave them the money to make this, but it's delightful. We're going to watch a little interview with a fake Crispus Attucks, Crispus Attucks, as they say in the video, to see what may have happened that night. Like I said, a lot of the, some of the things we're not sure exactly how it went down, but let's see what our little fake Crispus Attucks has to say.
This is Pamela Lynn Kolthauser, reporter for the Abolition News Network, broadcasting live March 10th, 1770 at the National Martyrs Mausoleum. Today we are going to talk to the first American martyr of the colonies about an event known around the world as the Boston Massacre. Please welcome Crispus Attucks. Welcome, Mr. Attucks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's just start. So now, why don't you describe to us in detail the events that took place on March 5th, 1770 on King Street, downtown Boston?
Well, It was a cold, moonlit night. There was about a foot of snow on the ground, and all of a sudden, a church bell rang out. And then, shortly after that, a rumor was spread that a barber was being abused by some British sentries, and a angry crowd grew in the streets of Boston. So I grabbed my corkwood stick and I went out and I said, we're going to keep the peace. I wanted to keep the peace, and no one was going to fight.
Okay. Well, before you go on with the story, what do you think the people of Boston, just an ordinary citizen, how did they feel about British rule, or even the Boston girls dating the British soldiers?
We don't like it. We don't like them dating our girls. We just don't like them lobster backs. They're just not, it's just horrible. And now we're like a garrison town with the British troops having unchecked power.
Okay. So who ended up firing the first shot that night?
It happened so fast. It was about 9 o'clock, and a brick was thrown. And one of the British sentries, he was stepping back and he slipped on a piece of ice. And when he slipped back, he fired up in the air.
Wow. So what happened next?
Well, after that, about 8 British troops from the 29th Regiment, they came and they fired head on towards the crowd. And I was hit first with 2 shots in the chest, and then 2 more were hit after that.
Wow. Can you describe the scene on the streets afterwards?
Well, I don't have to. Paul Revere, he put together this engraving to show exactly what happened. And as you can see, the British troops, they were firing point-blank range at us. And it was just horribly bloody. Samuel Adams, he called it the bloody butchery.
Wow. All right. Let's get back to our PowerPoint. So even our fake Crispus Attucks references or says, let's just look at the image. It shows what happened. One of the questions that you might consider in your discussion is where is Crispus Attucks here in Paul Revere's depiction? What has happened to Crispus Attucks? Like I said, we're going to look at this and talk about this as a piece of political propaganda. And I mean that neutrally. I mean that to say this is a political message, a political argument. Paul Revere wants you to come away from viewing this with a very specific idea about what happened and about the British. So you're going to talk about that in your discussion and compare it to maybe some of the info we heard from the fake Crispus Attucks. Think about what's different here. How is Revere using this visual medium to construct an argument? Like visually, what is this suggesting? Was there confusion? Is this a back and forth? Is it a scuffle? Are the colonists armed? Crispus Attucks says he took his corkwood stick. Was the firing accidental, or is Revere depicting something else? You might also remember what time of day is this supposed to be happening in? All right, we're going to scoot through. I know we got so much to get through. I want to talk about the Boston Tea Party, and then, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about common sense before we wrap up. All right, 1773. Again, this is another escalation. The English crown is still like, you exist to make us money. That's what you exist for. Stop being so rowdy. The Tea Act is a classic example of that mercantilism, that what the colonies exist to send raw materials back to England and to purchase English goods. What happened in 1773 is that the East India Company, a private company closely aligned with the crown, a private company that would eventually come to basically rule India. The East India Company has millions of pounds of tea that they can't sell because a tea bubble has burst and the value of tea has dropped. The crown says, no problem, we'll send it to England, and this will be the tea that the English colonists buy for however long we need them to. Now, the Bostonians love tea, right? The issue isn't that they specifically hate the East India Company. What they hate is this new act that says this is what you're going to buy, specifically to bail out the East India Company, to bail out England yet again. And here we have an attack on the Boston tax collector. This is a tarring and feathering, which could be deadly. You literally covered in hot tar and covered in feathers. If you weren't killed from a tarring and feathering, you would certainly be disfigured by it. You probably know that the Bostonians who threw the tea off the ships, threw the tea into the harbor, were dressed as Native Americans. This is not a disguise. They are not trying to disguise themselves. Everyone knows who this is and what is actually going on here. Rather, they're playing on an older association of Native Americans with natural freedom. Remember, John Winthrop saw that natural freedom as a bad thing, the freedom to do whatever you want. That's what marked Native Americans, according to Winthrop and other Europeans, as being uncivilized. And of course, this stereotype, this association of Native Americans with freedom, does also ignore the political, social, religious, economic structures that Indigenous people created and lived under. But we see this association in the minds of colonists here. They're looking for, well, what's a natural freedom? What's a natural liberty? How do I dress up to present that? It's going to be in this Native American costume. And we should also imagine that they did not do a very good job. Like when we talk about this not being a disguise, it's not just because everyone knew what they were doing, but they weren't very good at creating any sort of accurate Native American costume, shall we say. So did Britain calm down? They were like, all right, let's de-escalate this situation. No, you know they didn't. Another escalation, the Intolerable Acts, that's what the colonists called them. They shut down the port of Britain, the port of Boston. They outlaw Boston town meetings, some of those assemblies that were full of elected legislators. The town council is seized by British authority. You know, of course, that British soldiers can be quartered in private homes now. And this is going to be a weird one. They extended the Quebec Act into the Ohio River Valley. You're like, what's the Quebec Act? It granted religious toleration. Basically, it told all those people that had been in Quebec under the French that were Catholic, you can be Catholic in this new English colony. There's still a lot of anti-Catholicism among colonists in 1773. And they will see this Quebec Act as they get themselves all ginned up by they say that, oh, the British are going to turn us Catholic. The British are trying to make us Catholic. That's not what's happening. But colonists get all fired up, get all riled up over this. And they begin to distance themselves from ideas of English liberties. These English liberties aren't cutting it. The English don't acknowledge our English liberties. Maybe it's because they're not English liberties at all. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774 and endorsed the Suffolk Resolves that we need to start preparing to go to war with England. Congress creates a committee of safety. This is another one of those committees that enforces non-importation and fights enemies of American liberty. So basically is aimed at colonial loyalists, people that stayed loyal to the crown. What these local committees did is they widened political participation. Working class men and women served on these committees of safety that couldn't vote. You're going to see at the end of the revolution, they're going to demand the right to vote because in part because of the service that they did during the revolution. All right, let's look at Thomas Paine's common sense and think about the ways that, or I'm going to challenge you as you read it and read a little excerpt from the textbook as well, to think about this shift from English liberties to natural liberty, to freedom, to something that's universal, something that belongs to all people. And common sense, the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution itself are all influenced by those ideas of John Locke that we discussed, that authority is derived from the consent of the governed, that at its heart, you sign this contract where you give up some of your natural rights in exchange for, John Locke says, life, liberty, and property. But the heart of that is that you consent to be governed, and that's where authority comes from. Revolutionaries, patriots will say, we no longer consent to be governed by the English. And as you're going to see, Thomas Paine in 1776 creates a document that's widely influential, that's embraced by colonial patriots. It has this clear, direct style. It's not bogged down with Latin phrases. anyone can read it. And if you can't read and someone reads it out loud to you, you're going to understand it. It's written for common people, common sense for common folks. It's meant to be read by everyone, and it's published during these escalations. The patriots know that they're headed to war. Common sense creates a document that helps them defend these ideas that they already have. You're going to read a really short excerpt and think about what are some of the arguments that Thomas Paine is using, and how are they so accessible to people. Thomas Paine also had an influence alongside John Locke, of course, on the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. And one of the earlier versions of the Declaration had condemned the slave trade. That's crossed out because there's a concern that the Southern colonies will not join with that condemnation of slave trade in the Declaration. So that's crossed out. But we see these Lockean ideas of inalienable rights, the consent of the governed. And of course, Thomas Jefferson changes life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's even more remarkable when you remember that Thomas Jefferson himself is an enslaver. Locke says the government protects your right to enslave others because they're your property. But Thomas Jefferson here in the Declaration changes that to pursuit of happiness. Think about how that's going to open a door for others to extend that idea of freedom. Now, it took about 5 minutes for enslaved people to see this and be like, wait a second, we have some ideas about the pursuit of happiness and how our pursuit of happiness can be improved. It's going to happen so quickly. We're going to see immediately that these ideas will expand beyond preserving the rights and the liberties of colonial elites, of course. All right. Last thing, I'm just going to leave you with some global impacts of the revolution. We're going to still be in the revolution in Module 6. We're not leaving it yet. Global impact, of course, 1780, Tupac Amaru led a rebellion in Peru against Spain. 1789, the French Revolution. 1791, the Haitian Revolution. Both of their revolutionary documents crib heavily from the Declaration of Independence. These are a transatlantic triangle of revolutions that are building on each other. We'll talk later probably about why most white Americans don't support the Haitian Revolution. It's the largest and most successful slave uprising in modern history. And in case that name struck something with you, Tupac Shakur, his mother did name him after Tupac Amaru. All right, I'm going to leave you there. Start of the revolution. We're going to head back to the revolution in Module 6. As always, have a wonderful day and thank you for listening.